Dear listener, the first thing to disappear wasn't the signal. It was the delay. I was midway through transmitting upper atmosphere pressure data when the satellite relay stopped echoing my own voice back through the headset. Normally, there was a half-second lag, just enough to remind you that your words were climbing into orbit and returning through machinery. That afternoon, the echo vanished. Then the static came. I adjusted the gain knob on the console and repeated the coordinates of our station, reading wind velocity and temperature like I'd done every day for the past 11 months. Outside, the Arctic horizon was a flat line of white merging into overcast gray. Nothing moved out there unless the wind decided it should. "Central confirm receipt," I said. The only reply was a faint digital hiss. I switched frequencies, ran diagnostics on the dish alignment, and checked the internal power routing to the communications array. Generator output was steady. No voltage fluctuation. No visible fault in the relay chain. Then, without warning, the emergency alert banner flashed across the top of the main monitor. Global civil disturbance, shelter in place, await further instruction. The text appeared for less than 4 seconds before the entire screen went black. Not dimmed. Not frozen. Dead. I stared at my reflection in the glass for a moment before moving. I rebooted the system manually, cycling power through the primary console and auxiliary modem. The restart tone sounded normal. The login prompt appeared. But when I attempted a satellite handshake again, there was nothing to connect to. No uplink. No downlink. I stepped away from the console and walked toward the observation window facing the tundra. The storm that morning had cleared, leaving a brittle calm across the ice fields. The weather tower's anemometer spun lazily in a light wind. The world outside looked exactly as it had an hour ago. Inside, everything had shifted. I tried the emergency shortwave transmitter next. That system bypassed standard satellite channels and relied on broader frequency scatter. If there was traffic anywhere within 1,000 miles, I would hear it static. Not even fragmented chatter. Just open-band silence. I checked the station clock. 14:22 local time. The resupply aircraft was scheduled in 5 days. Even if communication failure was regional, they would attempt contact before approaching. No pilot would land blind in this environment. I returned to the console and scrolled through cached news feeds. The last update, timestamped 12 minutes before blackout, mentioned outbreaks of violence in several southern cities. Unconfirmed reports. Emergency services were overwhelmed. No detail beyond urgency. I zoomed the security feed covering the snow-packed landing strip. The runway lay untouched. No incoming aircraft. No distant contrails against the pale sky. The silence felt heavier than the storm had earlier that morning. In the Arctic, you learn to respect isolation. It sharpens discipline. It forces systems thinking. But that isolation always came with a tether, radio check-ins, scheduled flights, satellite uplinks. Proof that the rest of the world still existed beyond the ice. Now the tether was gone. I opened the station's technical manual and began running full diagnostics on every external antenna and cable junction. Physical damage could explain a localized blackout. I climbed the interior ladder to the communications loft and checked the cable seals manually. No ice intrusion. No severed lines. The equipment was intact, which meant the silence wasn't mechanical. I descended back to the control room and powered down non-essential displays to conserve generator load. If the outage was temporary, fuel discipline would still matter. If it wasn't, discipline would matter even more. I stood at the window again, scanning the endless white horizon. Nothing out there suggested collapse. No smoke plumes. No distant engine noise. Just wind tracing patterns across snowdrifts. But the world had gone silent. And in a place designed to measure weather, silence was the most unnatural signal of all. The plane was supposed to arrive at 0940. I was already outside at 0950. 15, standing near the snow-packed runway with my collar pulled tight against the wind. Visibility was clear, temperature hovering near -32. Good landing conditions by Arctic standards. I scanned the southern horizon for the faint shimmer of an approaching aircraft. Nothing. The resupply flight ran monthly, sometimes delayed by storms, but never without radio confirmation. Even if satellite communications were down, pilots carried independent long-range transmitters. Someone would have attempted contact. I waited until 10:30 before walking back inside. The silence inside the station felt different now, less like a technical anomaly and more like absence. I removed my gloves and opened the supply inventory ledger. The numbers had been comforting before. Predictable, calculated months in advance. Now they were finite. Dry food reserves, 12 weeks at standard caloric intake. Emergency rations, 3 weeks if stretched aggressively. Medical supplies, stable. Diesel fuel for generators, approximately 140 days at current output. 140 days sounded generous until I did the math. Spring thaw wouldn't begin for at least 5 months. Overland evacuation was impossible until the snowpack receded and river ice fractured. Even if the world beyond the tundra had stabilized, no aircraft would risk blind landing without confirmed communication. The Arctic did not forgive improvisation. I recalculated fuel consumption first. Generators powered heating systems, water recycling, communications arrays, and lighting. Heating accounted for nearly 60% of draw. Reducing interior temperature by even 3 degrees could extend fuel endurance by several weeks. Comfort was no longer relevant. I moved through the station methodically, shutting down unused living quarters and sealing interior doors to reduce heated air volume. I closed vents to storage rooms and powered off corridor lights not essential for movement. The station shrank from a research facility to a survivable core. Back in the control room, I checked the runway camera again. Still empty. The realization settled slowly but completely. The supply window had closed. No replacement food. No replacement fuel. No external support. Whatever had triggered the emergency alert had reached far enough to disrupt coordinated aviation in the most remote region on the planet. If the collapse was localized, someone would have called. If it was national, emergency services would have prioritized remote installations like ours. If it was global, I stopped the thought there. Speculation wasted energy. I returned to the ledger and recalculated caloric intake for a single occupant. 12 weeks could become 16 with ration discipline. Emergency rations could be preserved as contingency rather than supplement. Snow melt provided water indefinitely, as long as generators sustained heat. Fuel remained the critical variable. I switched the station into low consumption mode, reducing generator load by 15%. The interior temperature dropped gradually, settling into a colder but survivable range. I layered clothing rather than compensating with heat. Outside, the wind strengthened slightly, lifting fine snow across the runway in drifting sheets. The empty landing strip stretched white and untouched into the horizon. The plane was not late. It was absent. I walked to the storage room and ran my hand along the sealed food containers, feeling their weight as if memorizing it. Every can, every sealed bag, every measured scoop of rice now represented time. Time measured in days without rescue. I returned to the observation window and stared south again, though I knew no aircraft would appear. The station had always felt remote. Now it felt sealed. The world had gone silent beyond the ice, and the Arctic had closed its only door. Heat was no longer comfortable. It was arithmetic. The station ran on 2 diesel generators housed in an insulated annex connected to the main structure by a reinforced corridor. Under normal operations, both ran in rotation to balance wear. With no resupply flight and no external confirmation of recovery, redundancy became a luxury I could not afford. I shut down Generator 2. The silence after its rumble faded was immediate and unsettling. Generator 1 carried the full load, its steady vibration now the singular pulse of the station. I monitored voltage stability carefully. Output remained within acceptable range, but there was no margin for mechanical error. I pulled up the fuel projection model and recalculated consumption at reduced heating capacity. By lowering interior temperature by 5 degrees and restricting heated space to essential rooms only, I could extend diesel reserves from 140 days to nearly 180. Nearly 6 months. 6 months might reach spring. I walked through the station, adjusting thermostats manually. Research labs went cold. Secondary sleeping quarters were sealed entirely. I closed insulated doors and secured thermal curtains over rarely used windows. The building contracted around me, shrinking to a core of livable space. Control room, sleeping area, kitchen, generator corridor. Every cubic meter of heated air now had a cost. Back in the control room, I reduced lighting to half intensity. The Arctic winter would soon swallow daylight almost entirely. Artificial illumination would dominate the station's interior rhythm. I could not allow light waste to eat into fuel projections. I checked coolant levels in Generator 1 personally. In -40 conditions, viscosity thickened unpredictably. A clogged line could stall the engine within minutes. Without heat, interior pipes would freeze. Without heat, survival time inside the station dropped from months to hours. The generator was not machinery anymore. It was life support. I tightened hose clamps, inspected seals, and verified the exhaust system remained clear of snow drift accumulation. Even small obstructions could redirect fumes inward. Carbon monoxide was an invisible risk in sealed structures. When I returned inside, I logged every adjustment in the operations journal. Fuel levels, temperature settings, estimated endurance at current load. The act of writing steadied me. Discipline transformed fear into numbers. Outside, the tundra stretched empty and white beneath a pale sun that barely cleared the horizon. Wind moved snow across drifts in low arcs. The weather tower recorded steady pressure decline ahead of another incoming system. The world beyond the ice might be collapsing. Here, collapse would come only through miscalculation. I sat at the console and listened to the generator's rhythm through the floor. A constant mechanical heartbeat. I imagined it stopping and forcing the thought away. Contingency planning required focus, not imagination. I opened the maintenance manual and reviewed emergency restart procedures by memory, then by page. Cold start protocols. Fuel line priming. Manual crank sequence if battery assist failed. I rehearsed them mentally until they felt automatic. Heat equals time. Time equaled survival. And survival now depended on discipline measured in gallons, degrees, and controlled output. I leaned back in the operator's chair and looked once more at the silent communications panel. The world might have gone dark beyond the horizon, but inside this steel shell, one generator still turned. As long as it did, I would too. The storm arrived without warning. Pressure readings had suggested gradual decline, but Arctic systems didn't negotiate. By late afternoon, wind speeds doubled, then tripled, slamming into the station's steel frame with hollow resonance. Snow lifted off the tundra in horizontal sheets, erasing horizon lines and swallowing the runway entirely. Visibility dropped to less than 10 meters. I secured interior doors and switched exterior cameras to storm mode, narrowing lens exposure to reduce glare from airborne ice crystals. The monitors filled with white distortion, wind-driven particles striking the lenses like static. The Arctic was not reacting to collapse. It was continuing. I suited up in thermal layers and stepped into the airlock to inspect intake vents along the exterior wall. Snow accumulation at -40 could block ventilation in under an hour. Without airflow, generator exhaust could recirculate into the structure. The outer door resisted slightly under wind pressure when I opened it. The cold hit immediately, biting through exposed skin in seconds. I moved methodically along the wall, clearing drifted snow from vent housings using a reinforced shovel. Each motion required deliberate packing. Rushing in that temperature led to sweat, and sweat froze. The storm erased sound beyond its own force. Even if something moved across the tundra, I wouldn't see it in this whiteout. The Arctic did not require infection to be lethal. Exposure alone was enough. I checked the weather tower base, ensuring ice buildup hadn't compromised structural integrity. Wind howled through the support struts, vibrating metal against metal in a low, constant moan. The sound carried strangely, amplified by snowpack. Back inside, I sealed the airlock and allowed frost to melt off my outer gear slowly. Interior temperature had dropped another degree despite reduced heating volume. I increased generator load slightly to compensate, accepting the marginal fuel cost. Frozen pipes would be catastrophic. The storm intensified through the evening. Snow buried the lower half of the station's exterior walls, creating natural insulation, but also reducing visibility from outside. The structure was becoming less distinct against the landscape. Less visible. That thought lingered. If the infection had reached even remote regions, the Arctic might not protect through distance alone. Concealment could become as important as heat. I checked the perimeter motion sensors. Most were disabled due to storm interference, registering constant false triggers from wind-driven debris. For now, the weather itself masked any approach. I stood at the observation window as the last trace of daylight vanished. The world outside was reduced to swirling white under a black sky. No landmarks, no depth, just wind and ice. The station's interior lights reflected faintly off the glass, a beacon against darkness. I dimmed them further. The Arctic did not care about collapse, infection, or silence. It obeyed pressure systems and temperature gradients. It buried whatever stood in its path without preference. That indifference was both threat and opportunity. If the storm continued long enough, snow would accumulate high against the outer structure. Doors would require digging to open. Windows would disappear beneath drifts. The station could vanish into the tundra. I returned to the console and logged storm metrics while generator output held steady. Fuel reserves ticked down incrementally, but the structure remained intact. Outside, the wind howled without meaning. Inside, warmth persisted through calculation. The world might have gone silent beyond the ice, but here, survival remained governed by physics, not panic. And physics, unlike people, could be predicted. The storm broke just before dawn. Wind tapered from violent howl to distant moan, and snow settled into sculpted drifts against the station's exterior walls. I stepped into the observation room, expecting to see the runway buried beyond recognition. Instead, I saw movement. At first, it was barely distinguishable from wind-sculpted snow. A faint interruption in the white horizon, shifting against the low gray light. I adjusted the binoculars and steadied my hands against the window frame. It wasn't wind. A figure moved across the tundra, staggered and uneven, angling toward the station from the southeast ridge. No snowmobiles. No sled. No visible gear. Just a person walking. My first thought was relief. A survivor. Someone who had made it through whatever blackout had severed the world beyond the ice. But the relief evaporated as I focused on the gait. The stride was wrong. Knees locked too straight. Arms hanging with unnatural stiffness. The figure stumbled forward, corrected balance without visible coordination, and continued at the same pace. There was no hesitation in the cold. No instinct to shield face from wind. -40 should have crippled exposed skin in minutes. This person walked without reaction. I zoomed the external camera feed toward the ridge. Resolution sharpened just enough to confirm what my eyes already suspected. Frost clung thickly to the figure's clothing. No visible face covering. No gloves. Bare hands darkened from the cold. No urgency. I felt something colder than the wind settle in my chest. The emergency alert before blackout. Reports of violence. Civil disturbance. And now, in the most remote stretch of Arctic tundra, a human form moving without self-preservation. It wasn't supposed to reach here. The station sat hundreds of miles from any major population center. Supply flights were rare. Road access is non-existent during winter. The only explanation was that infection traveled faster than geography. The figure continued forward, slow but relentless. Snow drifted around its legs without altering direction. It was not seeking shelter. It was moving toward the structure. Toward me, I stepped away from the window and initiated full external lockdown protocol. The airlock system sealed automatically. Perimeter motion sensors recalibrated to detect close-range movement only, ignoring distant thermal fluctuations caused by residual storm activity. Heat signature. I switched the exterior camera to thermal mode. The figure glowed faintly against the snow, not with the intensity of healthy body heat, but with residual warmth. Enough to suggest metabolic activity, but reduced. Sluggish. It would take hours to reach the station at that pace. Time to observe. I watched through binoculars as the shape advanced, leaving a crooked trail across the white expanse. No other movement accompanied it. No pack. No equipment. Just a solitary approach. Isolation had been my shield. Now isolation meant no one else to intercept whatever this was. By midday, the figure had closed half the distance. I stepped outside briefly to clear additional snow from intake vents and scanned the horizon with my naked eye. Even at that range, I could see frost crusted along its face. Lips split. Skin darkened. Still walking. I returned inside and checked structural schematics. The station's exterior walls were steel and insulated composite, designed to withstand extreme wind and cold, not sustained assault. The main entrance was reinforced, but not military grade. If that figure reached the door and began striking it repeatedly, sound would travel through the metal frame. Sound carried over snow differently than over water. The Arctic was quiet now. Every impact would echo. By late afternoon, the figure was within 200 meters. It did not look up at the observation windows. It did not scan for entry points. It simply continued forward until it reached the outer perimeter marker post. Then it stopped, head tilted slightly, as if listening. I held my breath instinctively, even though the station's walls insulated interior noise. Generator hum vibrated faintly beneath my boots. Would it detect that through frozen ground? The figure stood motionless for nearly a minute, then resumed walking directly toward the main entrance. The Arctic had not kept the infection out. It had only delayed its arrival. And now it had found me. I didn't wait for it to knock. The moment the figure resumed movement toward the main entrance, I initiated full internal lockdown. The airlock door is sealed with a hydraulic hiss, locking pins sliding into reinforced sockets. I powered down the exterior beacon light mounted above the entrance, normally used to guide incoming aircraft through low visibility. That light was now an invitation. Inside the control room, I rerouted heating output away from peripheral corridors and into the central core only. If thermal signatures leaked through the outer walls, reducing surface temperature could make the station appear dormant from a distance. The Arctic punished heat. I pulled up the station schematics and marked choke points along the interior hallway. The building wasn't designed for defense. It was designed for research efficiency. Wide corridors, open lab spaces, windows positioned for observation, not concealment. I dragged storage cabinets into the main hallway and wedged them against the inner door leading from the airlock chamber. It wouldn't stop sustained force indefinitely, but it would slow intrusion. Through the exterior camera, I watched the figure reach the main door. It didn't hesitate. It struck the steel panel with both hands. The sound traveled through the structure like a muted gong. Not loud, but resonant. A hollow vibration that ran along the walls, and through the floor beneath my boots. It struck again. No words. No attempt at communication. No visible awareness of the cold biting its exposed skin. The impacts were steady, mechanical, as if driven by a simple impulse rather than strategy. I reduced generator output by another 2%. Less vibration meant fewer cues through the ice beneath the station. The hum beneath the floor softened further. If it could sense mechanical rhythm through frozen ground, I intended to minimize it. The figure paused, head tilted, then resumed striking. I shifted to thermal view again. Its body temperature appeared uneven, core warmer than extremities. Enough metabolic activity to function. Not enough to preserve tissue. I considered opening the external loudspeaker to test auditory response. The risk outweighed curiosity. Any noise might draw attention beyond a single infected. In the Arctic, sound carried for miles across flat tundra. I sealed interior lab doors and shut off unnecessary electronics that emitted faint operational hums. The station shrank again, contracting into its most insulated rooms. The impacts continued for nearly 15 minutes. Then they slowed, then stopped. The figure remained standing at the door, unmoving, frost thickening across its shoulders. If the cold was affecting it, the effect was delayed but inevitable. Exposure at -40 stripped heat relentlessly. I waited. 30 minutes passed. And hours. The figure finally stepped back from the entrance and drifted sideways along the wall, dragging its hands against steel panels before staggering away into the snow. I tracked it through the cameras as it moved in a slow arc around the structure, eventually disappearing behind a ridge of storm-drifted snow. It had not tried windows. It had not searched for an alternative entry. It had simply responded to structure. The infection was here. Not intelligent. Not organized. But persistent. I leaned against the control console and exhaled slowly. Lockdown had been held. For now, the station was no longer isolated. It was targeted. And from this point forward, survival would require invisibility as much as endurance. The storm returned 2 nights later. Not as violent as the first, but strong enough to blur the horizon again and mask subtle movement. I had just finished recalibrating generator load when I heard it. Faint, irregular, buried beneath the wind. A dull impact. Not against the main entrance this time. Lower, closer to the foundation. I muted all internal alarms and stood still in the center of the control room, listening. The Arctic wind roared against the steel siding, but beneath that roar was something else. A rhythmic vibration, not synchronized with gust patterns. Another impact. I switched the exterior cameras to thermal mode and scanned the base of the structure. Snowdrifts had partially buried the lower walls since the last storm, creating a sloped embankment against the metal exterior. At first, I saw nothing. Then the snow shifted. A dark shape moved within the drift itself, pressing against the wall where accumulation had reduced elevation difference. The infected had not approached the main door this time. It had followed the slope of snow upward, using nature as a ramp. It struck the siding again. The impact reverberated through the steel frame and down into the foundation beams embedded in ice. The vibration carried through the floor beneath my boots like a distant tremor. Sound beneath wind. The Arctic amplified what the wind could not erase. I moved to the interior maintenance, hatch that accessed the lower utility corridor. The corridor ran along the station's perimeter, housing pipes and wiring beneath the main floor. If the infected breached the exterior siding and insulation, it could potentially access that narrow space. I grabbed a flashlight and descended carefully. The utility corridor was colder than the living space, but still heated enough to prevent pipe freeze. I pressed my palm against the outer wall. Another impact shuddered through the metal. Closer now. The infected had found structural weakness, not through intelligence but through terrain. I returned upstairs and reduced interior heat by another degree. Less thermal differential between inside and outside meant less melt against the siding, which meant less structural softness. Then I shut down non-essential lighting entirely. The station dimmed to a low amber glow. Through thermal view, I saw two shapes now at the lower wall. The second must have approached during the storm, concealed by wind-driven snow. They pressed against the buried siding repeatedly, not climbing, not digging, just striking. The sound beneath the wind intensified. Each impact traveled through the station's steel skeleton and into the ice below. The ice itself transmitted vibration across the tundra like a drumhead. If more infected were within range, they would feel it. I considered using a flare gun to distract them, firing into open tundra to redirect attention. The flare would be visible for miles. So would the station. Instead, I shut down generator 1 for 15 seconds. The sudden absence of mechanical hum felt like stepping into a vacuum. Complete silence. The impacts outside paused. I held my breath, counting seconds. 5, 10, 15. Then I restarted the generator gently, bringing output online at minimal load. The hum returned slowly, almost imperceptible. Outside, the infected resumed striking, but less rhythmically. The pattern was clear. They responded to vibration shifts. The station was not only a visual target. It was an acoustic one. I remained awake for the next 6 hours, monitoring the base of the structure. The infected eventually drifted away as the storm intensified again, snow accumulating thicker against the siding. The burial was becoming inevitable. Perhaps intentional. The Arctic buried indiscriminately, but in burial there was concealment. I closed the thermal feed and leaned back in the chair. Sound carried over ice differently than over water, but the principle remained the same. Vibration invited attention. Silence confused it. From this point forward, the station's greatest defense would not be reinforced steel. It would be quiet. By morning, the lower half of the station was nearly gone. The storm had not weakened the structure, it had reshaped the terrain around it. Snow had drifted against the windward wall in thick, compacted layers, creating a natural embankment that rose almost to the first-floor windows. What had been flat tundra 2 days earlier was now a sloped incline of hardened white. I stood at the observation window and studied the transformation. The infected that had struck the lower siding were nowhere visible. Either the storm had driven them off or buried their approach trails entirely. The Arctic erased evidence without hesitation. For the first time since the blackout, concealment felt possible. If the station blended into the surrounding terrain, reduced its light signature, minimized heat leakage, and dampened mechanical vibration, it might become indistinguishable from the tundra itself. Not defended, not obvious, just another snowbound ridge. The idea carried risk. Burial meant limited mobility. If an emergency forced evacuation, digging out airlock doors would cost time and energy. Snow accumulation could also block exhaust vents if unmanaged, suffocating the generator. But visibility was vulnerability. I suited up and stepped into the airlock, pushing against the outer door until packed snow gave way enough for exit. The cold cut through immediately, sharper than previous days due to wind chill. Instead of clearing the snow from the base of the structure entirely, I shaped it. Using a reinforced shovel, I redistributed the drift along the lower wall, smoothing steep angles into gradual slopes. The objective wasn't removal, it was camouflage. From a distance, the station would appear less angular, more integrated into the surrounding terrain. I avoided exposing metal siding wherever possible. At the intake vents, I carved narrow air channels rather than wide clearings, just enough to maintain airflow without creating obvious structural lines. Exhaust piping was extended slightly using spare insulated tubing, so emissions would disperse beneath snow rather than plume visibly into open air. Inside, I adjusted the heating distribution again, concentrating warmth in interior rooms while allowing outer wall temperature to drop closer to ambient. The colder the exterior surface, the less melt would occur against the snowpack. Melt created shine. Shine created visibility. The station began to feel like a bunker rather than a research facility. I powered down all exterior lighting completely. No beacon. No perimeter glow. If someone or something approached at night, I would rely on thermal imaging alone. As dusk settled, I stepped back to the observation window and assessed the effect. The lower half of the building was nearly indistinguishable from surrounding drifts. Only the upper structure and weather tower remained clearly visible. Even those outlines softened as new snowfall continued to accumulate. Burial sacrificed perspective. My view of the runway was partially obscured now by sculpted snow ridges. The landing strip itself had vanished entirely under uniform white. If aircraft returned unexpectedly, they would see nothing but frozen terrain. I accepted that. Rescue was theoretical. Concealment was practical. Later that night, I monitored thermal cameras for movement along the snow embankment. Nothing registered within immediate proximity. If infected approached again, they would encounter a slope of compacted ice rather than exposed steel. Snow insulated. Snow concealed. Snow erased edges. The Arctic did not care about infection, but it provided tools to those willing to adapt. I logged the modification in the operations journal. Exterior burial partial, ventilation rerouted, thermal signature reduced. The station no longer stood above the tundra. It settled into it. If the world beyond the ice had fallen into chaos, then invisibility here would be survival. The Arctic was not an ally or enemy. It was an environment. An environment, unlike panic, could be shaped. The signal came just after midnight, thin enough at first that I assumed it was atmospheric interference. High-frequency static had been common since the blackout, solar fluctuations, shifting magnetic interference, the kind of background noise that filled empty airspace when human transmissions ceased. But this was different. It pulsed at regular intervals, not random scatter. I leaned forward over the console and adjusted the dial slowly. East Ridge, if any station remains operational, respond. The words were fractured, clipped by distance and distortion, but unmistakably human. My pulse steadied rather than spiked. Weeks of silence had conditioned me to distrust sudden hope. I fine-tuned the receiver again and recorded the transmission, replaying it through headphones to isolate background noise. Fuel limited, 3 survivors, repeat 3, East Ridge. There was only one research outpost in that direction, a smaller meteorological relay station nearly 400 miles east across open tundra and fractured ice fields. Staffed by 4 at most, sometimes fewer during winter rotation. 400 miles might as well have been another planet. I keyed the transmitter cautiously. East Ridge, this is North Point Weather Station. Single operator. Confirm your status. Static answered first. Then after a long gap, a response. North Point copy faint, hold transmission brief, fuel low, 2 injured. 2 injured. That meant they had not escaped, whatever had silenced the world beyond the ice. I switched to encrypted channel protocol, a procedure rarely used outside military coordination exercises. It reduced clarity, but offered narrower bandwidth. What's your external situation? I asked. The reply took nearly 30 seconds to return. Movement around the perimeter. Slow. Not wildlife. The words carried weight without explanation. The infection had spread farther than I had allowed myself to believe. 400 miles of Arctic tundra had not stopped it. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the thermal display of my own perimeter, empty for now, snowpack still disguising the station's lower half. East Ridge had no natural burial like mine. Their facility stood elevated on metal stilts above permafrost, visible from miles away. Fuel projection? I asked. 2 weeks at current output. Less if heat increased. 2 weeks. Travel across that terrain in winter required snowmobile convoys, fuel reserves, emergency shelters, and favorable weather windows. Even then, crossing took days. Attempting it alone would border on suicide. Staying here meant safety through concealment. Leaving meant risk in pursuit of connection. I opened the topographical map again, tracing the route eastward. Glacial ridges, frozen river valleys, open tundra with no cover from wind. Any mechanical failure mid-journey would freeze me within hours. But remaining isolated carried a different kind of erosion. The radio crackled again. North Point, any advice? Advice? I almost laughed at the irony. Reduce output. Conserve fuel. Limit thermal leakage. Avoid external lights, I replied. Monitor vibration levels. Sound carries under ice. A pause. Copy. The transmission weakened after that. Static swallowed the rest. I removed the headset slowly and stared at the dimmed control room. Generator hum vibrated faintly through the floor. Outside, the Arctic lay silent under a low aurora shimmer that painted green arcs across the sky. 3 survivors. 2 injured. 400 miles away. The station around me felt smaller suddenly, not physically but psychologically. Isolation had been manageable when it was universal. Now I knew others endured it too. I checked my fuel ledger again. At reduced output, I had nearly 5 months of endurance. Enough to reach spring thaw. Enough to survive without movement. Traveling east would consume nearly 1 month's worth of diesel between snowmobile fuel and contingency heating. It would also expose the station to abandonment. The infection had reached even this far. Movement might reveal it, but staying hidden meant leaving 3 people to fade into silence. The radio went quiet. The Arctic sky shimmered faintly overhead. For the first time since the blackout, survival was no longer only about warmth and concealment. It was about choice. I didn't sleep after the transmission. Instead, I spread the maps across the main console and began calculating the cost of movement in literal terms. Distance to East Ridge, approximately 387 miles by direct tundra route, longer if terrain forced detours around pressure ridges or unstable ice. Snowmobile fuel consumption at moderate throttle averaged 12 miles per gallon in winter conditions. Best case, I would need at least 65 gallons for a one-way journey. Double that for the return. The station's stored snowmobile reserve totaled 120 gallons. Leaving would burn more than half my mobility capacity. Worse, the generators required diesel from the same storage tanks. Diverting that fuel would reduce heating endurance by weeks. I ran the numbers twice, then a third time. If I maintained the current reduced heating load and diverted 60 gallons to travel, the internal fuel projection would drop from 180 days to roughly 142. 4.5 months. Spring thaw was unpredictable. A late winter could trap me beyond that margin. I moved to the snowmobile bay and inspected both machines carefully. Belts intact. Carburetors responsive. Fuel lines free of ice crystallization. But mechanical integrity meant nothing without contingency. A breakdown at -50 meant exposure measured in minutes. I returned inside and began drafting a travel kit. Insulated tent, portable heater, emergency rations, flare gun, spare ignition components, coolant manual crank. The pile grew heavier with each item. Weight equaled fuel drain. Fuel equaled heat. Heat equaled survival. I stared at the generator readout again. Stable. Steady. The station was not failing. East Ridge was. The moral equation pressed harder than the mechanical one. I turned the radio back on and waited for the next scheduled transmission window. Static filled the room until faintly their voice returned. North Point status unchanged. Shorter. Weaker. I pressed transmit. How long before heat loss becomes critical? Less than 10 days. 10 days. I calculated travel time again. Under optimal weather, crossing would take 4 days. If storms intervened, longer. That left a minimal margin for error. Can you reinforce the structure? I asked. Limited materials. Injury slowing work. Silence followed. The Arctic did not reward hesitation. I walked to the observation window and stared eastward into the endless white. No landmarks. No visible path. Just distance measured in risk. If I stayed, I preserved fuel and increased the probability of long-term survival. If I left, I reduced my own margin but potentially saved 3 others and gained allies. Allies meant shared labor, shared maintenance, shared watch rotations. Alone, every task drained energy incrementally. Together, systems stabilized, but together required arrival. I returned to the console and shut off non-essential systems again, squeezing another fractional percentage from generator load. If I could reduce consumption by an additional 5% immediately, I could offset part of the travel fuel diversion. Discipline before decision. I recalculated heating zones and sealed one more unused corridor entirely. The interior temperature dropped another degree. Fuel projection climbed by 3 days. 3 days closer to a viable margin. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes briefly. Fuel versus distance. Warmth here versus uncertainty there. The Arctic would not care which I chose. But the radio would not stay alive much longer. 10 days. The equation no longer allowed comfort. Only action or acceptance. I didn't commit to the full journey. Not yet. Instead, I chose reconnaissance. If the terrain proved impassable or infected density was higher than expected, abandoning the idea early would cost less than charging blindly east. I fueled one snowmobile with 15 gallons, enough for a controlled out and back test within a 40-mile radius. At 0520, under a pale blue Arctic dawn, I rolled the machine out of the bay and sealed the station behind me. Snow burial had concealed the lower structure effectively. From 20 yards out, it already blended into surrounding drifts. I throttled forward slowly. The tundra stretched flat and deceptive, wind carving subtle ridges into snowpack that could flip a machine if struck at speed. I kept my pace steady, eyes scanning for pressure cracks in underlying ice. The silence beyond engine vibration was immense. After 12 miles, I cut the throttle briefly and let the machine idle. No visible movement across the horizon. No drifting shapes like the one that had approached the station days earlier. Just white and sky. I resumed travel. At mile 23, I saw the first evidence, dark shapes ahead partially buried in snow. I slowed, approaching cautiously. They were human bodies, frozen mid-motion as if caught while running. One lay face down. Another knelt with arms extended forward. Preserved by cold. No scavenging marks. No wildlife disturbance. Their clothing matched that of a field survey crew. Perhaps independent researchers, perhaps attempting to reach another outpost when communication failed. Their posture told a different story. One body had a tear in the parka sleeve, fabric shredded not by the environment but by force. The second had frost crusted across its face, mouth frozen open. They had not died peacefully. I dismounted and knelt briefly beside the nearest body. The tissue beneath the clothing was stiff, preserved by temperature. There was no decay odor. The Arctic kept evidence intact. I scanned the horizon again. If the infected could move in -40 conditions, the cold did not eliminate them. It slowed them. Preserved them. That realization chilled more than the wind. I remounted and continued east another 5 miles before turning back. No additional structures visible. No smoke. No movement. The fuel gauge dropped faster than ideal under shifting snow resistance. Halfway back, I cut the engine again to listen. The Arctic answered with silence. But beneath that silence, faintly, I heard something, a distant mechanical hum. Not mine. I turned slowly in the saddle, scanning west and north. The sound was intermittent, carried unevenly by the wind. Then it stopped. I waited another minute before restarting the engine and accelerating toward the station. By the time I reached the snow-buried structure, my gloves were stiff from wind chill and fuel had dipped below half capacity for the round trip. Inside, I sealed the airlock and leaned against the wall, letting heat return to my extremities. The reconnaissance had confirmed 3 things. First, the terrain was navigable, but only under careful packing. Second, infection had reached independent travelers far from population centers. Third, I was not the only machine running across this tundra. Whether that hum belonged to survivors or something else, I could not determine. I logged the coordinates of the frozen bodies in the operations journal and marked the approximate location of the distant sound. The Arctic preserved everything, including warning. The long white crossing was possible, but it would not be empty. The first howl came just before dusk, not the broken, directionless moan of the infected. This was structured, layered, a call answered by another somewhere beyond the ridge. I froze at the console and pulled up the thermal perimeter feed. 3 heat signatures circled the outer drift line, low to the ground and moving with fluid precision. Wolves. They approached from downwind, instinctively testing scent carried across the snow. Burial had concealed much of the station's outline, but it had not erased smell. Generator exhaust, cooking residue, even trace human presence could draw them in lean winter months. Unlike infected, wolves calculated. One approached the snow slope near the partially buried wall and tested it with a paw, claws scraping ice. Another moved toward the airlock entrance, head low, tail rigid. I reduced interior lighting further and checked that all food waste had been sealed in airtight containers. I had been disciplined, but discipline now had teeth behind it. The wolves circled once more before one lunged at the siding, where snow insulation had softened the surface. The impact was exploratory, not frantic. It stepped back and reassessed. The infected had struck blindly. These animals were evaluating. I retrieved the flare gun from the emergency locker, but hesitated. A flare would scatter them temporarily, but it would also signal my presence to anything within miles. Instead, I activated the exterior floodlight for less than 2 seconds. The sudden burst of white illumination shattered the darkness. The wolves recoiled immediately, retreating several yards before regrouping at the edge of the drift. I shut the light off instantly, plunging the tundra back into dim twilight. They did not flee. They waited. I monitored their breath patterns through thermal view. They were not starving to the point of desperation yet. Their coats appeared thick and healthy, but winter tightened food supply quickly. If infection had reduced the human population, wildlife patterns would shift unpredictably. One wolf lifted its head and howled again, closer this time. The sound carried across snow with clarity, echoing faintly against distant ice ridges. I imagined being infected hearing that vibration and responding, though I saw none on the thermal sweep. Predators and infected occupied the same frozen ecosystem now. I checked the generator housing carefully, ensuring no residual warmth vented directly onto exposed snow where it could create scent funnels. Then I reduced cooking heat output entirely, switching to cold rations for the night. The wolves moved along the structure's perimeter slowly, occasionally pressing noses into snow against the buried siding. They were not attacking. They were mapping. After nearly 40 minutes, the pack leader, or the largest among them, tested the snow ramp again. It climbed halfway up before losing traction and sliding back down. Burial had altered geometry in my favor. Eventually, the pack drifted away toward the northern ridge, silhouettes dissolving into twilight. I did not relax. Wolves learned patterns. If they associated the station with warmth or food scent, they would return. Unlike the infected, they could wait. They could coordinate. The Arctic had added another variable. I logged the encounter and sealed the food storage containers inside an additional insulated crate. Waste would no longer be stored near exterior walls. Generator exhaust would remain diffused beneath the snowpack. Isolation had protected me from people. Concealment had slowed the infection. But the natural world was adjusting to collapse in its own way. Predators moved where opportunity appeared. I dimmed the interior lights further and leaned back in the chair, listening to the steady generator hum. In the Arctic, survival wasn't about defeating one threat. It was about enduring all of them without becoming the weakest presence on the tundra. The temperature dropped to -53 the night the coolant line froze. I woke to the sound before I understood it, a subtle fluctuation in generator pitch, barely perceptible unless you had lived with it for weeks. The hum beneath the floor stuttered, recovered, then thinned. I was on my feet before the alarm indicator fully illuminated. Coolant pressure had fallen below the safe threshold. If generator 1 overheated or seized, the interior would lose heat within minutes. Pipes would freeze. Fuel lines would thicken. Restarting under those conditions would be nearly impossible. I grabbed thermal gloves, tools, and the emergency lantern and moved toward the generator annex. The corridor was colder than usual, breath visible in the air. When I opened the insulated access hatch, the cold struck like a wall. The annex was partially buried in snow, exterior temperatures pressing hard against thin margins of insulation. I checked the coolant reservoir first. Levels were stable. That meant a blockage. I traced the line toward the exterior vent junction and found the problem immediately. Condensation had formed within a narrow bend in the auxiliary coolant return, freezing into a solid obstruction. The line ran along the outer wall. To access it fully, I would have to step outside. I checked the thermal cameras quickly. No visible movement along the immediate perimeter. Wind speed is minimal. Visibility is clear. I shut down the generator manually. The silence that followed was absolute. Within seconds, the temperature inside the annex began to drop. I stepped into the airlock and forced open the exterior door against packed snow. The cold was immediate and invasive, slicing through layered clothing. I moved along the wall to the exposed section of the coolant line and positioned the portable heater beneath it. The heater required power. I ran an extension from the emergency battery pack and activated it, directing concentrated warmth against the frozen bend. Steam rose almost instantly, frosting the surrounding metal as ice began to loosen. My fingers stiffened despite gloves. Wind cut through gaps in clothing with surgical precision. Exposure at this temperature reduced manual dexterity within minutes. The ice plug cracked audibly. I tightened the hose clamp slightly to reinforce pressure tolerance and cleared residual ice crystals manually, careful not to rupture the line. Inside the station, temperatures were already falling. I could feel it even through insulated layers. I shut off the portable heater and sealed the exterior access quickly, forcing snow back into place to preserve concealment. Back in the annex, I primed the coolant line manually, bleeding trapped air and verifying flow restoration. The pressure gauge rose slowly into the safe range. I restarted the generator. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared back into a stable rhythm. Heat began returning to the corridor almost immediately. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes briefly, counting breaths until my hands stopped shaking. -53 degrees did not forgive delay. If I had waited 10 more minutes to investigate, the line might have ruptured completely. If the generator had seized under load, internal freeze would have cascaded through every pipe and seal. Mechanical precision was survival. When I returned to the control room, the interior temperature had dropped 4 degrees but remained above the critical threshold. I increased output slightly to compensate, accepting the short-term fuel cost for system stabilization. Outside, the tundra lay still under aurora light, green bands shimmering across the frozen sky. The Arctic had tested the weakest link. Not infected. Not wolves. Just physics. I logged the failure and rerouted auxiliary insulation around the vulnerable coolant bend, adding a reinforced wrap to prevent repeat freezing. Isolation demanded competence. There would be no second chances at -50. The generator hummed steadily again. So did my pulse. The station held for now. The convoy lights appeared just before midnight. At first, I mistook them for atmospheric distortion, aurora refracting strangely along the horizon. But these were horizontal, low, and moving deliberately across the tundra from the northwest. 3 beams. White. Focused. Mechanical. I cut interior lighting immediately and switched all exterior feeds to thermal and low-light mode. The snow-buried station remained largely concealed, the upper structure barely distinguishable against the frozen terrain. The convoy advanced slowly, engines faintly audible through layered ice. Vehicles, tracked by the way they moved. Not snowmobiles. Larger. I leaned closer to the glass, pulse steady but alert. No chaotic movement accompanied them. No scattered infected trailing behind. The lights remained disciplined in spacing, maintaining a triangular formation. Military possibly, or organized survivors. They stopped approximately 1 mile from the station. Engines idled briefly before cutting simultaneously. Silence returned. Through thermal view, I counted shapes disembarking. 6 figures, armed based on silhouette profiles. They scanned the horizon methodically, optics raised, movements controlled. They were searching. The station's burial had worked. From their vantage, only snow ridges and faint structural edges were visible. No beacon light. No exhaust plume. No runway markings. I moved toward the flare locker and paused. If I fired, they would see the station instantly. If I remained dark, they might continue west and never know I was here. Isolation had preserved me, but isolation had also cost East Ridge. The radio on the console crackled faintly. Unidentified Arctic structure, this is Northern Response Unit 7. If operational, transmit or signal. The voice carried through open-band broadcast. Clear, disciplined, official. They had detected something, perhaps a faint thermal irregularity or buried structural outline. The figures outside repositioned slightly, one kneeling to examine snow drift patterns. They were not infected. They were not wolves. They were deliberate. I checked the fuel ledger one final time. 4 months remaining. Spring is possible, but winter was far from over. Shared resources increased the probability of endurance. Shared maintenance reduced individual failure risk. Alone, a single mistake nearly cost me the generator. With others, systems strengthened. But revealing myself also meant surrendering autonomy. No longer the sole decision-maker. No longer invisible. The aurora intensified overhead, green curtains rippling across the black sky, casting faint light over the frozen expanse. The convoy waited. The Arctic did not care which path I chose. I walked to the exterior emergency flare port and loaded a single red signal. 1 shot. No repetition. I stepped outside the airlock briefly, raising the flare gun above the snow-buried ridge line. The shot cracked sharply against the frozen night. Red light arced upward, burning bright against the aurora glow before descending slowly on a parachute flare. The convoy reacted instantly. Engines roared back to life. Headlights pivoted toward my position. Within seconds, beams cut across the tundra directly toward the buried station. Concrete and steel did not define survival here. Choice did. I retreated inside and sealed the airlock, watching through the thermal feed as the vehicles approached with controlled speed. Isolation had carried me through silence. Now the world, or what remained of it, had found me. Under the aurora, the Arctic sky shimmered above steel and snow. The station was no longer hidden. And for the first time since the world went silent, I was not alone.